Welcome. I'm Devesh Kapoor, the director of CASI, and I'd like to welcome you all to CASI's first Nand and Jeet Khemka sort of endowed lecture. Several years back, the Indian sort of historian Ram Guha, he wrote an obituary on the economic historian Dharma Kumar, calling her India's last liberal, and basically highlighting the narrow space the liberal intellectual tradition sort of occupied within India, squeezed both between the left and the right. I think Ram Guha was right in his assessment that liberals' sort of intellectual space sort of within India was rather narrow. Fortunately, like for us, he was mistaken in his bold claim on the last liberal. No one intellectual, I think, sort of in India challenges that claim more than our speaker this evening, Sir Dr. Pratap Mehta. For like many of you, he needs no introduction. After his sort of graduate work at Princeton, as faculty member at like Harvard, he returned to India, where he is the president of the Center of Policy Research, which under his like leadership has emerged as India's leading sort of think tank. He has published widely in political theory, constitutional law, so intellectual history, and Indian politics in a variety of papers, books, and as one of India's like leading columnists. If you think he's a very serious person, he's also a big follower of Bollywood and cricket. I think for those of you who've not like read it, I would particularly recommend like to you his gem of a book called The Burden of the Democracy, which along with Sunil Khilnani's book on the idea of India is, I think, one of the two most sort of excellent writings on trying to understand contemporary sort of India. I've known Pratap, sometimes perhaps to his regret, for about 23 years. And I think more than anything else, he exemplifies, like for me, that rarest of qualities, an integrity and intellectual fearlessness in speaking truth to power. Welcome, Pratap. We're also very fortunate in having Professor Sunil Khilnani. If you might recall, he gave a lecture here last year, and he's very kindly sort of agreed to say a few words sort of after Pratap's talk to launch us on our discussions. Welcome.
Thank you, Devesh, for that extraordinarily generous introduction. And I must say that, often you don't want to sort of associate your friends with what you're about to say, but I think Sunil and Devesh may be two people who are responsible for some of the reckless things I'm about to say, so I implicate them fully. I would like to thank particularly CASI and Juliana and Tanya, who have, I think, helped contribute in making CASI such a wonderful institution to be associated with. It's my sort of second trip to CASI, and it's wonderful to see CASI just doing so much pioneering research. I mean, really out of the box research on so many aspects of contemporary India. I think it was wonderful that Devesh invoked Dharma Kumar in his introduction, partly because what I have to speak about today, and particularly the central question I'm going to be asking today, is why does a certain kind of discourse about caste persist over time in independent India? And why does that discourse have to carry so much of the burden of what justice has come to mean in India? I think it's very much a question Dharma Kumar wrestled with. And in some senses, normatively, a lot of my positions are actually similar, probably to Dharma Kumar's on a whole range of public policy matters. But we have to think much, much harder about why that position has so little political traction. And I would say not even so little political traction. I'll describe what that position is in a minute. But I would say not even so little political traction, but why it has so little intellectual traction in the Indian context. Now, as we know, India at this conjuncture represents a spectacle of profound social and economic change and immense social contestation. I think India's growth story is real. It is very widespread and is leading to a churning at all levels of society that is really quite unprecedented in all kinds of ways. It's unsettling norms, leading to new forms of contestation of power hierarchies. I think CASI's study on Dalits in Azamgarh, the work McNeil is doing in CASI on sort of, new rural markets, all of that is really mapping that profound social change, in ways that are really astonishing. I also have to say, and I think in a way that if one reflects on this process of change, I think it'll warm the heart of those those whose philosophy of history is what the great intellectual historian Duncan Forbes once described as skeptical Whiggism, which is that a lot of this change is a product of lots of unintended consequences, strange historical accidents and conjunctures, is appearing in the most unexpected of places. But the second element of skeptical Whiggism was that a lot of this positive change is actually being driven by venial motives. If you remember Adam Smith's classic description of, the demand for luxury goods and trinkets and baubles, in a sense, undermining the aristocracy, leading to the possibility of profound change in Europe, you have that sense in India. And I'll come to this point in a little bit. For example, I actually do think there is nothing more revolutionary than corruption in the way in which it actually unsettles forms of society. So a lot of actually, in a sense, this change is being driven not by design, not by any sense kind of any grand ideological unfolding, not even as it were well-intentioned action. And I think it behooves us to sort of think harder about how we actually explain this. But my topic today focuses on a different aspect of this change, which is, as with any period of profound change, there are also immense social conflicts. And India has, at the moment, if you just read the newspaper any day, the entire range of social conflicts you can imagine, around all kinds of axes you can imagine. You have Maoists waging a guerrilla war. You have forms of ethnic secessionism. You have quiet daily forms of protest. You have farmers sometimes agitating against the politics of dispossession, which takes away their lands, sometimes clamoring and agitating to have their lands taken away in certain parts of India. You have new forms of identity politics, and particularly very, very subtle forms of Dalit assertion emerging. So there's a really astonishing array of social conflicts that is accompanying this. Now, it would be impossible to give a full analytically informed tour de horizon of what are the axes that define these social conflicts, what are the drivers of these social conflicts. What I hope to do in the next half an hour or so is two things. First, I want to, as it were, place these social conflicts in, as it were, a larger debate about the relationship between democracy and equality in our time. And second, by doing that, sort of raise a question about why, or at least argue the following proposition, that one of the reasons caste remains such a central axis of, as it were, social contestation in India, and why it's almost literally impossible to dislodge the hold that a particular kind of discourse on caste has in India, has something to do with that larger failure of the relationship between democracy and equality. What I'll be doing is a bit reckless. It'll meander through a little bit of political economy, a little bit of constitutional law, a little bit of intellectual history in ways that will make the practitioners of each of those disciplines cringe a little bit. But I hope that the juxtaposition of these different facets might allow us to ask some fresh questions about Indian politics. So, now, the present politics of social justice must be seen against the backdrop of a general and perhaps more global phenomenon, which is a certain kind of pessimism about the relationship between democracy and equality. Democracies, as we all know, Political Theory 101, were born out of a will to political radicalism. But they have turned out to be remarkably conservative institutions when it comes to attacking social and economic inequality. In fact, the predictions of so many 19th century thinkers, Tocqueville, obviously the most prominent example, who pointed out, as it were, the conservative implications of democracy, have come out to be largely true. I mean, of course, Adam Smith also reminded us that a democracy would be the last to abolish slavery. Now, there is a wider global debate happening about why is this the case? I mean, why does democracy turn out to be less, as it were, radical in its implications for social and economic inequality than many of its biggest votaries had hoped, right? And essentially, as far as I can see, the debate around this centers on one cardinal proposition. Is democracy's inability to mitigate social and economic inequality or allow new forms of social and economic equality to reproduce, is that an essential characteristic, right, of the form of political democracy? Or is that something to do with, as it were, something more contingent, having to do with things like the ways in which political parties are organized, the role of money in politics, those kinds of sort of things that political scientists study? And I say this is a global debate because just a couple of months ago, I happened to be reading sort of side by side two books written from very different intellectual traditions. One, Wang Hui's, who's China's leading intellectual historian, a book on sort of the new revolution in China. And the second was, of course, Adam Jaworski's book, new book on democracy and self-governance. And what is striking about both books, I mean, they have different methodologies, they have, you know, Wang Hui still belongs to a certain kind of Marxist tradition in a way, is both seem to be wrestling with this question very, very centrally about why is it that democracy cannot be expected to be somewhat more radical in its implications for social and political equality than its proponents hope. And essentially the answers sort of turn out to, or at least the themes both of them wrestle with, turn out to have, as it were, two lines of inquiry. One line of inquiry, which is the old one, and which economists have sort of now tried to defend in a new form, is that one reason why democracies are not very good at mitigating social and economic inequality and have high degree of tolerance for it. I mean, obviously there are variations cross-country, but broadly speaking, that as a proposition seems right, seems to be what you might call, as it were, the cumulative outcome of small liberty effects, right? So that there's that old debate about, as it were, the balance between equality and liberty, and that if the kinds of liberties that political democracies allow, just by the workings of their natural operations, will produce great inequality. So one very graphic example of this in the economics literature is this great paper by Devraj Ray and Dilip Mukherjee on persistent inequalities, where they basically just do a simple thought experiment in modeling saying, if the difference between the rate of return on whatever assets you happen to possess is 0.2% over 30 years, how will that, as it were, translate into new forms of inequality? So that there is something endemic. I mean, again, in political philosophy, this has been, you know, a very basic axis of debate. There's something endemic to liberty, as it were, producing inequality. But the second line of debate, and this is where the juxtaposition of Wang Hui and Adam Jaworski was interesting, is that there doesn't seem to be a clear consensus around what kinds of instruments do democracies have for producing more social and economic equality. There are basically 4 or 5 kinds of instruments that democracies use, and I want to briefly go through the politics around those instruments in the Indian case, right? To set the scene for, as it were, the broader discussion of caste. Now, the first instrument for redistribution in democracies is obviously taxation, right? So certainly there is a lot of potential redistributive implications of taxation. But in the Indian context, there is no politics, no real powerful politics around redistribution through taxation for three reasons. First of all, because in a sense, India has just emerged from, as it were, a long experience of counterproductive experience of high rates of taxation, right? And we can empirically debate what an optimal sort of rate of taxation in India should be. In my view, is it that our rates are actually still lower than what they could be, right? But the fact is, as it were, that the experience and the disillusionment, right, with that period of high rates of taxation, which is shared across all classes in some senses, makes the argument that you can use taxation as an instrument of redistribution very hard to get off the ground politically, right? Second, as we know in the Indian context, right, there is a political economy that Pratap Bhanu had classically described, which basically prevents, as it were, the broadening of the tax base. So the number of direct taxpayers in India still remains very, very strong, and powerful political, it's very hard to, as it were, attack powerful political lobbies, particularly rich farmers, and bring them in at least the direct tax net. And the third argument, skepticism about taxation as an instrument of redistribution, is really based on, as it were, globalization, right? So that under conditions of globalization, there's only a certain kind of bandwidth within which you can use taxation as an instrument of redistribution. Now, each of these propositions is, of course, empirically debatable and challengeable. There is evidence on both sides of this. I mean, my own view tends to be that I think India can use higher rates of taxation, even on the, as it were, that group of people which is within the tax net. But the fact remains that as an item of political discourse, there seems to be a consensus, except on the far left, that taxation is not a hugely potent instrument of redistribution. Taxation is a potent instrument of enhancing the revenues of the state and being able to create a certain kind of welfare state whose characteristics I'll come to in a minute. But there are severe limits on how much you can use taxation as an instrument of redistribution. The second, as it were, instrument, or the second modality is, of course, nationalization or socialization of the means of production. That argument post-1989, of course, has been off the political agenda for a long time. Right? The third instrument, particularly in agrarian democracies, which was a very potent mobilizing force, was, of course, land, right, as a means of redistribution. But the politics of land in India has taken a very interesting twist in the last 15 to 20 years. And there is great skepticism about land reform as an instrument of redistribution, again for three different reasons. First of all, in places where, if not land reform, at least some form of regularization of land rights could probably help the poor, like Bihar, right, which is something Nitish Kumar has been proposing in this sort of, reform of the Bataidari system, something like a Bihari equivalent of Operation Barga. There is a great deal of skepticism about the state's capacity to be actually impose that kind of regularization of the rights of sharecroppers and tenants in ways that gives them more security. And we can discuss this in the question period, why this is the case, why Bihar can't do a Bengal, as it were, on an Operation Barga style securing of greater tenures. But even more importantly than that, whether or not there's state capacity, there's skepticism about land reform as a way of egalitarian distribution, because in a sense, the average size of land holdings is becoming smaller and smaller, and there are limits to how much land reform can actually empower. As Partha Chatterjee has argued, the big debate in rural India is now how to get off the land, as it were, as a form of empowerment rather than actually getting land. And the third thing, which is a feature of India's uneven development in the last few years, is that the politics of land is very much differentiated across different states. And one of the interesting arguments you see actually in India is that the resistance to acquisition of land is much greater in poorer states for two reasons. One, because, as it were, the economics of giving up your land is very different. So the going rate per acre in Orissa will be very different from the going rate per acre in Haryana or if you're anywhere near Mumbai, right? So the economics of giving up land has become very different, and they're two very kind of contradictory interests. In states like Haryana, you literally have farmers clamoring to have their land be acquired by industrial houses. But the second reason is, again, paradoxically the following, which is that your ability to move off land depends on what other endowments you have. And in India, the paradox is that the richer the state is, the more likely it is that possessors of land see actually a alternative economic path from themselves out of land, right? Partly because of the rate of return they're getting on the land, partly because they have developed linkages, right, with urban centers, which allows them to make the transition. The problem is that the poorer there is the state, like Bihar or Orissa or West Bengal, the less likely do these pathways exist. Right? So what you're going to find around the politics of land is a great degree of contrary interests and differentiation. So land is not sort of very high as a potent instrument of redistribution. The third, as it were, instrument, and which is really where all the political energies are focused, seems to be on the creation of a welfare state. So here the core social argument, social contract argument goes like this. India is experiencing high growth of rate. Even without high rates of taxation, that high growth rate of growth does increase government revenue. If you can use this government revenue to create a welfare state, right? So with all the classic attributes, right to education, health, rural unemployment insurance and so forth, you could bring about some degree of redistribution. Now I want to say two things about, I think, this politics of welfareism before coming to sort of the main argument I'll make. The two things that are very striking about the politics of welfare in India are the following. At one level, the UPA government in the last 6 years has, as it were, created a proliferation of rights. Right? So we passed a right to education bill, there's a right to food bill coming up, right? Which seek to make social and economic rights judicially effective. Right? And send a signal that the state is taking them seriously. There are, however, two issues with the way the state has gone about it. The first is that the state is setting its bar on what these rights are supposed to do very low, and is fighting, as it were, battles that made sense 10 or 15 years ago. The Right to Education Act is a perfect example of this. Right? At one level, we say it's a landmark act. Right? The state is finally guaranteeing every child a right to an education. Right? What's the ground reality? The ground reality is that India's enrollment rate is actually in excess of 100%. Access to school is not a problem. Right? In fact, the right has been enacted after that access was already achieved. Right? What is a problem is, of course, the quality and distribution of those schools, which the Act does actually very little to address, or it addresses in the classic way that government addresses these things, which is by more investment in infrastructure rather than human capital. Right to food, right, currently being debated, and there will be in legislation in the next session of Parliament. What is shocking about what the UPA government is proposing by way of right to food is that it is very much tailing the practice of most states. So two very different states, Chhattisgarh and Tamil Nadu, have already universalized the PDS system. These are the two states that have some of the best running, as it were, public distribution systems in the distribution of food. Right? And what the central right is promising is simply a pale comparison on every measure: administrative efficiency, the quantum of entitlement, the ease of access to entitlement. I'm even setting aside the whole issue of delivery systems, which is the core problem in the Indian state. So in some senses, you might say that the bar on the welfare state is being set very, very low, even though it's couched in this very elevated rhetoric of rights. But the most interesting thing from the point of view of discourse of justice about the discourse in the welfare states is in almost all my conversations and as it were, analysis of the discourse around the welfare state. Nowhere is the welfare state seen as a locus of justice. In fact, what is actually quite striking about this is that this welfare state is at best seen, right, as a bare minimum necessary condition that allows hitherto marginalized citizens to access some services which they need. Right? But that's just about it. In fact, in education and in the discourse of education, it's actually interesting that there is a great fear that the Right to Education Act, well, I don't think it's particular to the Act, I think it's particular to our education policies, will actually reproduce new forms of inequality. Why? Because although it will give access to education to everybody, the fact is that in a competitive system of education, right, your historical endowments seem to matter a great deal. And there's very little in the Act that can actually help you overcome that. In fact, you know, there's a disjuncture between the logic between which the government presents what the justification of the Act and how it's actually received on the ground. And that disjuncture is best seen in the debate in India around meritocracy. There is a ideological argument for the Right to Education Act, which basically says that, look, this will allow India to create a genuine meritocracy, right? Because it will give everybody access to education, right? So you can have a genuine meritocracy only if there's open access. The interesting thing is that in most of the sort of targeted beneficiaries of that act, meritocracy is the one thing that is seen as the antithesis to justice, and very rightly so, right? Because meritocracy is associated intrinsically with a competitive system that actually reproduces inequalities no matter what, as it were, the starting point is, right? And in fact, the logic of meritocracy has had one unintended political consequence, which I think actually the United States also experienced some version of it, you know, which Robert Young, in his old book, The Rise of Meritocracy, had warned us many, many years ago, right? Is that when you have a meritocracy, the elites have a great sense of entitlement to what they have, right? You can shame an aristocracy, you can't shame a sort of the top echelons of a meritocracy, right? So that paradoxically, the very rhetoric of meritocracy actually produces even less support for an egalitarian politics of distributive justice. Right? Yeah? So we are at that historical conjuncture where there is a great deal of skepticism about what kind of redistributive politics can you actually engage in modern India. Now I must clarify that this doesn't mean that poverty can't be reduced, people's sort of, you know, lives can't be improved, but the form in which that improvement is articulated is not, as it were, is not the language of justice. Right? It's something, as it were, else altogether. We also are experiencing in India something that Adam Jaworski has been consistently highlighting in almost all democracies, that increases in inequality are very rapid in periods of change, and, as it were, much more rapid than any decline in inequality than the instruments of economic policy that democracies use can actually produce. Right? So there's a very, as it were, sobering pessimism about distributive justice, which confirms again Jaworski's thesis that no country has rapidly equalized, as it were, market conditions without some kind of cataclysm. And the debate in India and China is exactly parallel. I mean, it seems to be independent even of, as it were, regime, you know, a regime type for the reasons that I mentioned. Now, if there is this pessimism about a politics of equality and a politics of distributive justice, then it opens up, as it were, a large gap in Indian politics. And I'll just take a 2-minute detour through sort of intellectual history and then come back to the contemporary point again, where caste politics fits in this. Now, when you read the Constituent Assembly debates, we are often reminded of Ambedkar's, as it were, famous articulation of the Indian constitutional experience that India is entering a life of political equality, but a life that coexists with social and economic inequality. Right? So this is going to be the fundamental contradiction of modern India. What I think people pay less attention to, right, is that in this distinction that Ambedkar makes, and almost all our kind of members of the Constituent Assembly make, between something like what they think of as constitutional justice versus substantive distributive justice, they actually made a very self-conscious choice for constitutional justice. And it comes out in 3 ways in Ambedkar's own speeches in the Constituent Assembly. First of all, he has a very interesting take on why the Indian Constitution should not be socialist. Right? Why socialism should not be part of the Constitution. He simply says 2 things. One, there's a democratic argument. Let the process of democracy decide the choice of an economic system. Don't constitutionalize it. But there's also a causal argument. He actually says at one point, we simply don't know the causal conditions under which betterment and equality can be produced. So this is something you have to, as it were, leave open to experimentation. Right? So for that reason, as it were, the distributive justice is not part of that basic constitutional framework. The second, as it were, facet of his commitment to constitutionalism comes out in, as it were, his commitment to what he called constitutional methods. And he had a very specific meaning in mind to that, which contrasts constitutionalism with 2, as it were, conditions. On the one hand, there's a contrast between constitutionalism and revolution. So the one thing constitutionalism does is it's self-consciously against revolution. Right? And Ambedkar was actually very clear on that. Again, a very clear choice he made. But the second thing is that a constitutional order is also very self-consciously against forms of politics that operate outside the modalities of established institutions. To use Partha Chatterjee's phrase, the kind of politics that you actually find in political society, in the distinction that Partha Chatterjee makes, which is, and partly Ambedkar had this in mind because he thought actually that the best exemplar of that kind of politics was Gandhi's Satyagraha, which he thought was the ultimate form of both non-pacifism and non-constitutional politics. But one of the unnoticed legacies of, as it were, Ambedkar's defining constitutional politics, as it were, this way, has been, I think, an interesting effect on the Dalit movement, and many scholars in this room can speak more about this, which is to say, except with the exception of Dalit Panthers, right? By and large, India's most marginalized groups have been the most, as it were, ardent votaries of constitutional politics in India. I've been just doing this sort of, exercise of looking at sort of, if you take examples of Partha Chatterjee's, actions in political society, right, which these are basically strikes, informal negotiations, those kinds of things. Which are the groups that actually resort to those modalities of protests? Right? You find Dalits are almost never, right? Dalit groups never take to that modality of protest in independent India. It's very, very rare, right? Compared to a whole range of other groups. So there is, as it were, a commitment to it. And in fact, I argue that Ambedkar in this sense turns out to be an even deeper pacifist than Gandhi is in his vision of what constitutional politics requires. And the third sense in which Ambedkar's, as it were, allegiance to constitutional politics was interesting was his defense of parliamentary government, which I think has not been discussed very much. He makes a very striking claim about why India should be a parliamentary democracy, not a presidential form. The empirical premise of that claim is questionable, but I think that the theoretical direction he wanted to move in is interesting. He basically argues that what India needs is a form of representative government that can do 2 things. First of all, it can constantly monitor the executive. Right? John Keane has recently described India as a monetary democracy with a TI, although he might have said TEA as well. Wouldn't have, both descriptions would have been accurate. But Ambedkar had a very, very clear conception, right, that India is a monetary democracy in that sense. But it came with another sort of theoretical notion which is interesting, that nowhere in the Constituent Assembly debates that I can figure out is there any concern with what form of representation actually reflects the will of the people. In fact, their biggest fear is that you should not let the executive or any part of government singularly be able to claim that they, as it were, represent the people. I mean, it's a very anti-representation notion of, as it were, democracy, and which is one of the reasons why Ambedkar didn't like presidential systems, because, in a sense, that's kind of representative, the embodiment, literal embodiment of representation in one figure, right? So that there was a very self-conscious, as it were, refusal of the language of representation, although India is a representative democracy. But you did not want to be in a position to say that this is the form of representation that we can say best expresses the will of the people. In fact, what you want to do is keep contesting every claim to be representing the will of the people, right? Now, what this choice did, was that it did open up this gap, as I said, between constitutional justice and this kind of broader politics of egalitarianism and distributive justice. And Ambedkar is, as it were, very candidly says, we don't know how this gap will be closed. All he says is, if it's not closed, Indian democracy may collapse. Right? Yeah? But given the experience of Indian democracy with egalitarian politics that I started out with, in the political economy of egalitarian politics, the natural question arises, where will the politics of equality be actually embodied? In the Indian case. Right? Now, this is where I think the discourse of caste becomes actually very, very crucial. The big fear about constitutional justice in India is that constitutional justice is not about equality, it's about what Adam Jaworski again has called anonymity. So that ideally, in constitutional justice, who you are should not matter to what rights and privileges you have. Right? Okay. Given the historical legacy of inequality in India, right, that very idea of constitutional justice that Ambedkar presented as an ideal actually becomes a threat. Right? Because anonymity is seen as putting a veil over existing inequality. I mean, this is a fairly sort of kind of familiar argument. Right? But once anonymity is seen as putting a veil over existing structures of inequality, you are then left with this, as it were, conundrum: on what basis does one seek equality? Because the very natural candidate provided in the constitutional discourse is equality qua individuals, right? Where your identities don't matter to what rights and privileges you have. That itself becomes, as it were, a legitimizer, or at least seen to be, throwing a veil over existing inequality. It's in that context that the demand arises for, as it were, demanding equality on the basis of caste. Right? So equality is not about transcending caste. It is that equality is demanded on the basis of caste. Right? And why is this notion sort of interesting? And this is the larger point I sort of want to end with, is there has been this debate in India constantly about the relationship between caste and class. Right? In all affirmative action debates, in all Marxist debates, is class a better category or caste a better category for mobilization from the point of view of social justice? What I think has been less noticed, right, is why it is that Indian political parties and across the political spectrum, everybody rejected the idea of class as a basis for mobilization. The reason for that is the following, and this came out in an interview I recently did with a politician, but the core argument is the following. Class equality, right, is something like an oxymoron. Okay? Either you have equality, or you don't. You can have class. You cannot have class equality. Right? Okay? So that the politics of, as it were, using class as a basis of mobilization. And the way it was graphically put, and think about this dyadic structure, right? So this is a senior politician saying the following. If I'm poor and I become rich, I become not poor, and I'm still in a relationship of hierarchy to whoever remains poor. Okay? That's the, so in a sense, in class, what class politics is seen as it were, an instrument of individual mobility, rather than an instrument of structural transformation. Caste politics has a very peculiar relation of equality. So if I am Dalit, a Dalit poor, and I become a Dalit rich, right? Qua Dalit, I'm equivalent to some other rich person now. So there's a kind of third element, right? So that within the structure of politics, that whole question of equality of what, and what is your measure of equality, becomes much easier to articulate. Right? And caste has become, as it were, the form in which the egalitarian impulses of the constitutional movement have actually come to be sublimated. Precisely because, right, as I said, both this theoretical reason about class politics, as it were, being an instrument of individual mobility rather than structural transformation, and this general historical pessimism about redistribution. Right? So, in a way, the prospects of a politics based on class or economics, right, would have to depend upon some convincing case, right, for how social democracy or some form of socialism might be included. As a politician said very explicitly, the only way you can have successful class politics is by the abolition of class, right? That's the objective. Right? Since we cannot do that, right, the only basis on which we can demand equality is caste. Right? The second feature associated with this is that given our historical experience, and this I think all of us liberals have to admit, class has come to be seen as a legitimate form of inequality. Right? It's a legitimate form of equality, not in the sense that those who are in disempowered classes deserve to be in that class. Right? But we see class, the existence of class, as part of a structure of necessity, right, that we don't know how to overcome. Right? So that in that sense, despite us, this kind of 50, 60 years of the discourse on poverty and so forth, right, we see of class as at least a necessary feature of a modern society. Right? Once you see class as a necessary feature of modern society, right, it cannot be the basis for demanding, as it were, equality. So that caste has acquired, therefore, is that caste is the only form available, because individuals are not, as a unit of equality of what, who should demand equality. Right? The abolition of economic inequality is not. Right? Caste is the only way in which the historically inherited legacies of inequality can be actually sort of sublimated. Now, this has had, as it were, lots of different consequences for politics. But once you go down this route of saying that the only basis on which you can demand equality is caste, right, then the political space opens up on what are the sites of power where you can demand this kind of equality. And what we have seen over the last 40 years is a transformation of that kind of Ambedkarite vision of, as it were, parliamentary democracy, right, being a monetary democracy, to parliamentary democracy being a representative democracy, right, in the particular sense understood in the caste discourse, which is the advantage of caste politics, is that it simply gives you a straightforward numerical measure for measuring the sharing of power, right? 50% for you, 30% for me, 40% for that, right? The only question remains is what are the sites to which this measure can be extended? And the second challenge of caste politics, right, is that just as the anonymity of the constitutional division, right, threw a veil over existing inequality, in the very same way, the categories of caste that, as it were, are granted recognition as the basis of deserving, special forms of recognition, that, as it were, throws a veil over different kinds of contradictions. I mean, as you know, Ram Rawat has kind of written about the ways in which the state uses those categories, right, abstracts from the real contradictions and the real struggles of the people contained within those categories. But this is a necessary feature of that discourse, right? Precisely because you cannot have on this view a politics of equality unless you have, as it were, a set of compulsory identities to go with that politics. Right? As I argued a few minutes ago, the attraction of caste politics is that it gives you a ready-made basis on which to demand equality. That ready-made basis can endure only if there is a fixity to that caste identity. Right? So as I said in this transition, if you are a Dalit poor and you become a Dalit rich, you can still be part of a calculus of division of power. But if you say, no, I become a Dalit rich and I'm not a Dalit anymore, right? In a sense, both the measure of equality and the basis on which you demand equality has actually disappeared. Right? So in short, what I think as liberals we have to think much harder about, right, is can we really hope to overcome the attractions of caste politics, right, without seriously addressing these broader social democratic deficits of Indian democracy? Right? Which is that so long as those deficits remain powerful and so long as there remains this gap between constitutional justice and distributive justice, we cannot find any way of articulating a politics of equality in India other than through categories of caste. And I think this is a central theoretical challenge that liberals working in India have actually not addressed at all. I'll stop there.
Thank you. I'm just going to keep this very brief. I mean, that was a wonderful example, I think, of what Devesh was saying in his introduction of Pratap's capacity to move across such a range of fields: intellectual history, political theory, constitutional discourse, and also the urgency of contemporary politics. And it was also an astonishingly powerful and sophisticated account, very complex. So it's certainly, I have no very smart things to say in by way of comment. But I guess, just two very general thoughts. I mean, one is I think that Pratap captures very accurately this moment in Indian politics and history now, where we have had, for a generation now, for 20 years, a great focus on the economy, on growth within the economy, and on the great opportunities that's been opening up. But that's not been matched by a coherent thinking about what we're going to do with that growth. It's been somehow a belief that it's going to sort itself out, that many of the problems that we've had in our politics and in questions of justice and equality from the past are somehow going to be resolved in a kind of almost natural process by the growth that India has been experiencing, or parts of India have been experiencing. And I think now it's very much a point where there's a real need to engage with some of these very basic questions of social design and institutional design. What kind of society India can hope to be? And so I think this return to these very basic questions of social democracy, but in a very different context, is an important move and moment in Indian thinking. And I think so in relation to what's happening in India, I think there's something very, very powerful that Pratap is doing. But I think also in relation to the more general discussions about justice that have been happening globally, he brings a very, very interesting and important set of arguments and illumination to that. Because, I mean, on the one hand, this idea of justice as reason, essentially working out the terms of what justice are and then trying to find a way to enact that, as opposed to this idea of justice as inherently conflict, justice as inherently being about the relations of power within a society, has been a very sort of deep division. And I think in recent years, it's the former in academic discourse which has dominated very much. The idea that we can have a clear picture of what a just society is, and that will somehow do a lot of the necessary work for us. And while clearly there's a role for that, I think what Pratap in his analysis of the Indian situation has emphasized is that the indeterminacy very often at moments of great social change of what actually the contours of justice are, and how they are very much ideas in conflict. There are arguments and interests that are in conflict, and it's through that perhaps some kind of notion of what a more just society might be. And I think in that sense Ambedkar very much, as many of the others of that generation in India, did take this very political view, that not committing to a defined picture of what India was going to be, not committing to a heavily ideologically specified picture, but to one that left it to the battles and shifting conflicts of politics. And of course that is a much messier, ambiguous and complex legacy to deal with, and we've, as Pratap suggested, we've done our very best to keep it messy and complex and ambiguous. But there are also real dangers in that, and I think trying to get some clarity on what the nature, what is in conflict, really is an important thing. I think, I mean, the other thing I might just mention is, I mean, in terms of the instruments that democracies can use to address the question of distribution, one thing that I thought Pratap didn't really mention, although I think it was implicit in what he was saying later, was the role of political parties, political movements. And that does relate to the question of caste, because the account that he was giving about the need to preserve the identity of caste if it's going to make claims about justice, in some ways is actually stands in a tense or even contradictory relationship to the politics, which invokes castes as a form of political organization. Because castes and caste parties are actually not able simply they are having to blur, to compromise, to engage in coalitional forms, to somehow not simply stand for the caste that they might in name stand for. And so is there something actually in the very dynamics of the political process that is undermining this need for clear caste identities which can be the units that can make claims on justice. So that was just one more immediate thought on the Indian context. But I think I'll just stop there and let the rest of you comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Pratap, will you take some questions? The floor is sort of open. Yes, Jack.
Your point that class equality is an oxymoron is certainly true if equality is taken literally.
Yeah.
But could there not be a politics aimed at reducing the inequality among classes rather than eliminating it altogether?
No, I mean, I agree with you. I mean, in the sense the way my counter was constructed today is very stylized and sort of stark, and in some senses, in the actual politics, it's precisely a whole range of these messy intermediate options that are there. But I think, but I want to sort of two things in response to that, which is that, first of all, I think there isn't any compelling evidence on the ground, at least to the political actors that are involved in this, which convinces them that we are in a position at the moment to, as it were, use the instruments that could actually mitigate the effects of inequality. And I mean, here we can have a big kind of comparative discussion about the conditions under which and that mitigation takes place and the extent to which that mitigation is possible. Certainly Brazil's example comes to mind in recent years of a country that's sort of at least, gone round the curve, as it were. But that kind of politics is not available in part at the moment, as I said, precisely because of this absence of instruments that have credibility on the ground that could achieve precisely that. The second, I think, issue with that, which goes back to, in a sense, the caste question, is, so the way the debate in India is often framed is, there is identity politics, there's the politics of caste, and then there's the politics of economic empowerment, reducing class inequality, social mobility, sort of all the good things good liberals would want. And the point, the trajectory you want to see in politics is to move India from identity politics to that kind of politics of effective governance and so forth. My own hypothesis and I guess prediction about India over the next few years is that on the ground these are not seen as alternatives. Rather, these are seen as actually complementary to each other, which is that precisely even in places where you have the benefits of economic growth, where you have reasonably effective sort of welfare states sort of functioning, trying to do precisely what you suggest, mitigate the effects of inequality. That, as it were, that historical impulse about trying to give equality some kind of basic constitutional political expression remains actually stronger. Right? So that it's not an accident that you can get a state like Tamil Nadu, for example, which arguably is the one state that in a sense, in terms of economics and potential state capacity, has that the greatest potential for moving to this trajectory, also sees at the same time an intensification of that kind of politics. So that you can have both processes going on simultaneously, which is, yes, you might get some reductions in inequality, but it, as it were, doesn't take away the need to, as it were, politically sublimate or find new bases for making equality claims.
Yes.
Thank you. This was really interesting and also a very convincing account that you've given. And so a little bit I'm sort of sitting here and thinking about, well, why would we ever want to transcend caste? And one of the reasons that there is a discomfort with the caste politics and an identity politics is because of the mechanisms by which caste identities are maintained, right? So you mentioned at one point that politics of equality in India requires the existence of compulsory and fixed identities. So the ways in which that happens is through the enforcement of particular marriage norms, through the enforcement of social hierarchies. And so I'm just wondering if we sort of reintroduce the I guess now slightly dated debates over multiculturalism and the politics of recognition, then what's missing from this is in fact an equality of dignity, right? And that gets taken out of the discussion. So while I think your account of the ways in which class and caste intersect in Indian politics and maybe are necessary as sort of as paired twins, I'm wondering what happens to all of the injustices of caste that are to do with status and not with economic inequality.
No, that's a wonderful question. I think a couple of things. One of the paradoxes, right? So you're right. I mean, historically, caste has been reproduced through lots of different mechanisms, and of course, marriage was the kind of the central institution in that. And the conditions under which that is likely to break down are, I mean, we are still light years sort of away from that. I mean, you can just think of the basic common sense sociological conditions. Do you have common schooling? Do you have common colleges, right? I mean, just those basic nuts and bolts. Some of it is marginally beginning to break down because of migration, urbanization. But those concrete sociological mechanisms that can break hold, that can break the hold of those conditions remains, powerful. But the specific sense in which a new form of fixity has come to caste identity, right, is through, as it were, the legislation of officially sanctioned categories of caste identity, right? And in some senses, the advantage of this official sanctioning is that it can survive even changes in those traditional social dynamics. So as Dhirubhai always says that, in a sense, caste as a political category becomes much more salient and much more fixed precisely at the moment of the possibility of actually greater social change. And the emphasis on, for example, things like these legislated categories, like OBC, SC, ST, and all of that, right, is that at one level the political attraction is that they will survive all these, as it were, other exogenous changes that are happening in society. The second thing which I do want to, which I didn't get time to go into, is that I think one of the most interesting things about discourse on justice in India, which given India's constitutional vision is quite surprising and shocking, is that the one thing we cannot talk about with any degree of systematicity and openness is discrimination as a category. Because what happened, in a sense, was that discrimination was a concept that, I mean, obviously it's still a social reality, particularly for Dalits and so on. But analytically, discrimination as a concept made sense against that conception of anonymous constitutional justice that Ambedkar talked about. So, right? So you're discriminated against whether you're being targeted for who you are, right? Now, the sense in which discrimination has dropped out of the picture is twofold. First of all, because power sharing arrangements have been constitutionalized in different forms, and there's greater push to do that in newer and newer forms, essentially that sharing of power has come to bear the weight of justice. I mean, how can there be discrimination if there's reservation, right? I mean, that's the kind of standard upper caste sort of response, right? Because the numbers, as it were, match up. But the second and more important thing is that to keep the momentum of this caste politics going, which is that if you're in a situation where the only way in which you can make any equality claims is through your caste identity, you then needed to construct a discourse on caste that went beyond, as it were, victimization through discrimination. Right? And the most obvious manifestation of that is, as it were, the fusion of Dalit and OBC discourses around caste justice. So at the time of independence, there was a consensus that there is a group of people who are so marginalized, impoverished, oppressed. I mean, no matter which way you cut it, right? You deserve special special recognition, right? That discourse, right, is exactly the same discourse that then other groups actually take over, right? So that the form in which you get justice, right, becomes this, as it were, the same for Dalits and in a sense OBCs, right? So that the specific sense in which discrimination was a historical category against particular groups, right, gets subsumed under this larger politics of making equality claims on the basis of caste. Right? The other facet of discrimination, which is kind of is that discrimination at one level, of course, it's a collective concept in the sense that you're discriminated for being a member of a particular group. But its experience is always, as it were, contextual and individual, right? You're discriminated in a context, in a labor market, in a, in an education system, in a sense, a high degree. Very, very little focus on the mechanisms that can actually be used to redress those forms of discrimination. Because they will require precisely the kinds of subtle individuations that our constitutional vision talks about, right? So in that sense, the politics of representation and visibility of equality claims on the basis of caste has, as it were, at some level sort of eviscerated discrimination as a central category of our political consciousness.
Jeff?
Oh, wow. Pratap, your account is cast in a kind of lament that there were radical aspirations in the creation of democracy moving in a more dramatically egalitarian direction. But in India, at least, we have instead politics of caste that reproduces itself in ways that can ameliorate some injustices, but have sharp limitations in moving in egalitarian directions. And I see the power of that argument, but it seems to me that if it's right, we can't leave it at the lament.
Yeah.
We have to consider, given the tenacity of the politics of caste that you described, the choices at the outset to strengthen it in constitutional recognition, you have to think about how you work with the politics of caste to move in as constructive a direction as possible. And you indicated in your answer to the discussant's comments that in fact we do see some blending of a politics of recognition with a politics of distribution, and that leads me to wonder, well, first, to preface it, let me say I'm skeptical about the account that democracy in India or anywhere else originated in a really radically egalitarian moment. I think it much more originated in quests for standing, inclusion, recognition, and that the logic of seeking standing nonetheless can point to the efforts to achieve not just formal legal recognition and formal rights, but the kinds of more egalitarian distribution of resources that move toward an endpoint where different kinds of caste identities or other identities might survive, but they would no longer be associated with predictable systems of inequality in economic resources and other kinds of hierarchy. And so the question is there room in a politics of caste to work not toward the elimination of caste, which is an aspiration that I hear in your comments, at least not in the foreseeable future, but to the kind of decoupling of caste with systems of inequality precisely by using this politics to work for more egalitarian distribution. And once that was achieved, whether caste survived or not, would be much more a matter of what people chose and would be much less consequential for structures of economic and political inequality.
As always, you've succinctly given a very, very powerful historical account. No, I mean, I actually agree with you. I mean, and something we've learned from you more than anybody else. I agree with you. I don't think democracy was born in that moment of great, as it were, radicalism. At most, it can be described in a certain context as a political radicalism, but certainly not a great egalitarian radicalism. And in fact, there was a lot of allegiance to democracy precisely because there was great confidence in its as it were powers to, as it were, reproduce the status quo. And in particularly countries like India, as you rightly said, the route to democracy was through nationalism rather than sort of democracy into nationalism, which is that in the context of colonial movement, the way to claim self-government was, as it were, and independence was to base it on this combination of nationalism and democracy. So I actually agree with that. I also agree with, in a sense, the other two comments you make, that of course it can't be left as a lament, and what are the possibilities of moving to a more nuanced position. A couple of things on that. One, I think, yes, I do leave it as a lament, but I think in part perhaps it's because in a certain kind of intellectual context in India, I think there's been relatively less, I think, honest thinking amongst, let's say, liberals in a scale about why that tradition has had so little political traction. And in a way, the way the debate is framed, as I have done it in my, I'm sort of as guilty of this as anybody else, has been in that kind of classically normative frame. Well, won't we like a society where people's identities didn't matter to what rights and privileges they have? How can we have forms of legislated forms of recognition that simply reproduce those identities generation after generation and even more tightly link the rights that people have to those particular identities, even though this might take a somewhat egalitarian form, right? So that's, in a sense, the debate, whether it's around affirmative action, whether it's around, caste representation in politics and so forth. So, at one level, this is a kind of lament in service of moving away from framing it that way. I think we've sort of lost that battle, and if it remains at that level, I think we're not going to get any political traction. So that's one sort of thing. The thing that I think makes the Indian story slightly different from, in a sense, the American one, because in a sense, as you've articulated in your work, the American trajectory towards these forms of recognition as the basis for creating new spaces for equality, but they remain rooted in identity, and I think there are two sort of differences which I think are worth, and which is the kind of the cause for, as it were, pessimism. Which is that the first is that these identity categories are not so much, so what is being demanded in recognizing them is not that they be taken into account in designing systems of distribution or access to services. They obviously need to be taken into account in conditions where you have historical inequity. Otherwise that anonymity argument is very powerful, that it's basically throwing a veil over inequality, right? It is that the form in which that they need to be taken into account requires the state to legislate them into existence and then, as it were, fix them. So if you take the debate over caste census, which we are currently underway in India, just to put it very crudely, the fundamental dilemma is caste a self-identifying category or not? Can you stand up and say, I am not this caste? Right? In effect, once the state recognizes you through that prism, it's basically saying you don't have the right to do that. Right? That is, I mean, in that sense, the tyranny of that compulsory identity is, as it were, far stronger. It's not simply that the state has to take that into account, it's the state can say, look, once we have certified that you are X caste, you remain X caste. I mean, it doesn't matter what the. So there is a new institutionalization of that compulsory identity within, as it were, the formal structures of law in the state, which is, I think, far more stronger than anything in a sense in the American case, which then correlates with the second sort of idea of, as it were, escaping caste, right? So that, I mean, there are Indian thinkers, you know, who are the intellectual progenitors of this caste politics, like Raman or Loya, whose basic sort of thesis was, look, we will go through the stage of equality through caste, and then there will be this sort of, as it were, escape out, right? Through greater individuation, right? But if the state consistently, right, blocks that process of greater individuation and differentiation by imposing these compulsory identities, I think then you need to begin to worry. And the second reason, which I think is worth talking about, is that in the US, at least in the discourse on race, and I want to kind of perhaps draw a quick analogy with the race and caste issue, is I think what was interesting about the affirmative action thing in the US is, I mean, it's not so much the specific programs and so forth, we can debate how effective those were. But there was a recognition that fundamentally there has to be an ethical correlate to this quest for justice, right? So it's fundamentally about how people of different races actually relate to each other, what are the norms and protocols that should govern them, right? My worry in India is that while you're getting this discourse of distributive justice, right, but because it is being defined around sharing of power in measurable ways, it has in fact to a certain degree impeded that ethical correlate that needs to go among citizens. So in a sense, now the equilibrium is, well, everybody's got their share of power, you know. There isn't an ethical correlate about how individuals relate to each other as citizens that actually has to accompany that. And I think this sort of, this papering over the concept of discrimination and replacing it with representation, in a sense, is an example of that. So those are my sort of worries about the way it's going.
When I was listening to it, it occurred to me that there's actually a very simple explanation, a very simple observation that you're making over and over again that had never occurred to me before, and that is that it is easy and legitimate for the state to take, especially in terms of taxation. It is rarely legitimate for the state to give. When the state gives, the state has to give indirectly, not to persons, through media that are very diffuse. And so even when the state can give, one doesn't experience it as receiving. And in fact, it gives very rarely. But the state takes easily. And this means that redistribution is always going to be extraordinarily difficult for states. And I wonder, you made a very intriguing observation in passing at the beginning when you said corruption is revolutionary. And I wonder if you could connect those two things.
Okay. No, I mean, you know, that's this is a very intriguing question. No, I mean, I think you're right about this kind of asymmetry between taking and, as it were, distributing. And I think it's in a way interesting. I mean, it's sort of implicit in the point I made that is why, in part, the politics of, as it were, producing a better welfare state, right, is actually not seen very much as part of a discourse of distributive justice. I mean, it's almost as if, well, you know, states tax and they do sort of, as it were, certain. I mean, it's considered a desirable thing, but not necessarily expressing a politics of justice, right? And it may be in part because, right, the way one conceptualizes justice in this context is precisely by asking the whole kind of question, who deserves what? And there isn't a question of deserving that is actually associated with this as well. The corruption angle is, I mean, there's a kind of side, and the way it relates to this is the following. I mean, corruption is revolutionary in two different ways. One, that what the politics of growth has done in the last few years, contrary to many expectations that it will lead to a reduced role of the state or reduced interest in the state in some respects, is that it has basically transformed the character of rents that you can extract from the state to, as it were, a scale unimaginable. Right? So the stakes in seeking access to state power have actually become higher rather than lower. Right? And in some ways, the sites at which is actually going to play out in the next few years is actually this whole decentralization debate in India, which many argue decentralization is very important to making democracy much more inclusive and participatory. Right? But once the scale at which even local governments operate increases and transforms, right, the stakes in the politics that are being produced around it actually increase. Right? Now, corruption has been revolutionary in, as it were, two ways, which is the impulse to use the state and the impulse to gain access to state power, right, has in part been driven by the extent of rents you can actually extract from the state. And as the scale of those rents change, the forms, patterns of mobilization around it change, incredibly. But it has also been revolutionary in the following sort of sense, which is that it has given an avenue to lots of people for a form of social mobility that they could not have imagined in any other arena outside of getting access to state power. And that is actually what's defined the possibilities of new forms of coalition politics sometimes, sometimes in India. But the sense, so that, I mean, that's the kind of the broad corruption as a form of churning. But the particular sense in which corruption, of course, impedes the politics of social democracy is that it is inherently a politics of individual mobility. Right? I mean, some people get access, other people's, others don't. And what it has cumulatively contributed to is, as it were, a skepticism about the state and a decline in the legitimacy of something called the public, or the public as it was sphere in right. So that in that form, it actually, as it were, only reinvigorates the question, which is, yes, the state can be an avenue for mobility of certain kinds, right? And it can induce certain kinds of change, but it cannot be the locus of a politics of justice in that sense. I mean, it's almost a politics of competitive loot, which is revolutionary in its own way. But it's not a politics of justice.
Listening to you, the first is that repeating the paradoxes of liberal democracy of the 19th century. And this is more easily explained or demonstrated with respect to European history, perhaps, than with respect to American history. The second thing, which is related to that, is that once again, in describing the very eloquent way that you have, the incredibly complicated politics of caste and class, we're confronted again with the limitations of stating that equity principle in rights terms. So I would assume, given the description of the upper class and the upper caste elements of Indian society, that it would be possible to do the kind of distribution or gift giving that Ann Norton just mentioned in aristocratic terms, but not in democratic terms. And so the concept of rights in a rapidly developing country like India might have more traction in explaining how these problems might be overcome than the concept of rights in the liberal democratic sense.
Thanks very much. To follow the historical question with an anthropological one. As I was listening to you, I was reminded of some of the anthropology on class, and the old anthropology, not sort of the ones that have been written more recently on middle classes, but really sort of even Andre Bete's work on Jyotidas, and really thinking about how class categories are actually thought about in different contexts. So in my work in markets, for example, one will continuously come across the use of old and new terms for service class, sarkari class, adhikari class, vyapari varg, even the difference between, so traders, state officials, bureaucrats, even the difference between being a mazdoor or a naukar. And that the distinctions between these aren't simply talked about in economic terms, but very much in terms of freedom or choice to be an entrepreneur versus to be an entrepreneur. So it would be interesting to see how this both contributes in some aspects to your argument, but also perhaps challenges it and asks questions about how does one think about this maybe slightly differently.
I was actually very struck by the fact that you moved your argument about discrimination only in your responses to people, and then you came back to it appropriately several times. Because it seems to me that if you made that central to your analysis, then the so-called liberal constitution, the liberal comfort with constitutionalist politics gives way in the face of an understanding of the accrued material power of discrimination to suggest that caste is very far from simply a set of identities that can be mobilized, but is the dominant way by which human potential and material reality can be circumscribed and enabled. So it would seem to me that if you shift to discrimination as the central tenet of your analysis, a very different and perhaps a less easygoingly liberal version of the same debate would emerge.
Could I take and ask you a mischievous question? Why are there so few liberal intellectuals back in India?
Well, if Suvir is right, we should have many more. The last question first, because that's easy. I think what you said is absolutely right, except that I think that argument would be compelling if, as it were, the politics of recognition that we are talking about in this context were conjoined to the narrative histories of discriminated groups. So long as I think this politics took the form, again, to make a crude generalization, of Dalits, I think that argument was compelling. I mean it's a no-brainer, as it were. It's just so straightforward, right? I think where this account is coming from is coming from the fact that form of recognition, which initially had its motivation in recognizing discrimination and making it, as it were, the central challenge of liberal constitutionalism, has then got expanded, right, beyond its original association with discrimination, to the point that discrimination is not even a central political issue in the same way, except for that, right? Both sociologically and, as it were, normatively. The idea that, in a sense, let's say in a state like Tamil Nadu, 70% of the population, right, or in other states, OBCs, can now partake of that very same narrative that made that Dalit recognition possible, is a distinct historical question. So that one of the reasons I don't begin with discrimination is because I think discrimination would, as it were, explain certain forms of Dalit politics and their relationship to Indian constitutionalism. It would not, as it were, get us very far with this sort of expanding of, what you might broadly call quotocracy beyond its original confines. So that's why I didn't make.
Even if you took Nandini's question seriously and you thought about gender discrimination as central to the logic of kinship systems and thus of caste systems. Do you think that won't be? No.
I mean, I don't mean to say that the discrimination is not a sort of a central category. This is really about sort of, in a sense, explaining the persistence of a certain kind of caste discourse beyond, as it were, its inevitable associations with the narrative of discrimination that you actually, sort of talked about. Ellen's and Mekla's questions. Mekla, I agree with you. I think First of all, we do need much more powerful and nuanced ethnographies of both caste and class, how they are actually operating in everyday practice and the kind of sort of reconfigurations. But my hunch, I mean, this is just, I'll sort of throw it out as a one sort of line proposition, and maybe we can discuss this at some point, is that I think what's happening to the politics of caste, I mean the interesting thing about politics is that it's becoming more and more dissociated from precisely these actually messy realities, right? I mean, in a sense, I mean, I think, you know, Ram has made this argument about, you know, the categories of, let's say, Chaman and so forth in, you know, the UP, right? And I think one of the powerful points he makes, in a sense, is that there is a kind of official juristic discourse around these categories, which then sort of fix them, which in principle is quite dissociated from these forms of everyday self-understandings, right? And is actually in turn coming to transform them, right? So I think part of what one needs to do is not just look at sort of how class is being used, but in a sense how it's being displaced, or can in some instances coexist, right, with this officially legally sanctioned, as it were, you know, discourse. So what does it mean to be, you know, a big industrialist OBC at the same time? And what does that juxtaposition, as it were, do, right? That's I think something that one needs to, as it were, think about more. And that my worry about what the state is doing is precisely that. It's actually abstracting away from exactly those complex self-understanding in politics that you're actually talking about. Ellen's question, big. All these. So I think here's just one kind of capsule thought on this, which is we have thought of rights claims as, in some senses, expressing aspirations to equality, right? So rights is associated often with equal rights. I mean, to have a right just means to have a right. But suppose you're operating in another sort of environment where there's a consensus on those issues as a matter of political rights, so free speech and so forth. We all have equal rights in that sense. But rights claim in any other context is basically seen as specifying a baseline, right, threshold on which we all stand, right, above which the politics of inequality can continue unabated. Right? So the example I was giving in the Right to Education Act in some respects is that you can read it two ways. In a classical egalitarian politics, you will say it's giving everybody an equal right to equal education, whatever that means. I mean, that's itself a, you know, right? Or you can read it another way, which is that it's the state providing a, as it were, a floor, right, on which everybody can stand. Right? But that is actually quite compatible with reproducing great forms of inequality, as it were, above it. Right? And I think that Indian discourse of rights is very much, and probably for good reason, so I mean, in the social and economic case, very much that very kind of minimalist floor conception of rights. That what it is doing is that it might enable some necessary conditions for individual mobility, but what it does not do is achieve anything like an egalitarian conception of justice, or even anything close.
Well, I know it's several of you may want to raise more questions, and it's always a measure of Pratap's talks that all of us want to carry on this conversation further, but we are sort of beyond our time, and I'm sure Pratap would be willing to talk to you sort of after we finish. To Pratap, we are very, very grateful. It was a sobering analysis, but that's the reality of like India, and we hope you will continue to illuminate us. Thank you.